December 7th, 1942. Operational Headquarters, U-Boat Command, Boulevard Suchet, Paris. Corvette-Captain Eberhard Godt leaned over the plotting table, watching as his staff positioned red markers across a large-scale chart of the North Atlantic. Each marker represented a U-boat, and together they formed what Admiral Karl Dönitz called a patrol line, a barrier of submarines stretching 200 miles across the expected path of convoy ONS 154. 43 boats, the largest concentration Godt had coordinated in a single operation. If the convoy sailed into this trap as predicted, the sinkings would be catastrophic. The room hummed with controlled urgency. Radio operators transcribed incoming position reports from boats at sea. Intelligence officers updated weather forecasts and convoy routing predictions. Staff officers calculated interception courses, fuel states, and torpedo inventories. Everything depended on coordination, on the boats knowing where to position, and themselves, on headquarters knowing where the boats actually were. Everything depended on radio communication. Godt drafted the operational order himself, translating Dönitz's strategic intent into precise tactical instructions. The message would be encoded using Enigma, transmitted on shortwave frequencies that could reach boats operating 1,000 miles into the Atlantic, and received by every commander in the Wolfpack simultaneously. Grid references, course headings, attack procedures, all compressed into alphanumeric groups that seemed impenetrable to anyone lacking the daily cipher keys. The system had worked flawlessly for 3 years. German signals intelligence assured them that British code-breaking efforts had made no significant progress against naval Enigma. The transmissions were secure. What Godt didn't know, what none of the staff in that Paris headquarters understood, was that security and detectability were two entirely different problems. The Allies didn't need to read the messages to know exactly where they came from. The moment a U-boat transmitted, high-frequency direction-finding stations scattered across the Atlantic basin would detect the signal, measure its bearing with extraordinary precision, and triangulate the boat's position to within 10 miles, sometimes within 5. The technology existed on both sides, but the Allies had deployed it with a sophistication and coverage density that German naval intelligence had catastrophically underestimated. The mathematics of direction finding were simple. Radio waves travel in straight lines. If you can determine the direction a signal is coming from, you've established a bearing line. If two stations take bearings on the same transmission from different locations, those bearing lines intersect at the transmitter's position. 3 or more stations provide redundant data that eliminates ambiguity and increases accuracy. The physics were understood. The challenge was execution building. Receivers sensitive enough to detect weak signals at extreme range, precise enough to measure bearings to within a degree or two, and fast enough to capture brief transmissions before they ended. British scientists had been obsessing over this challenge since 1939. The Admiralty's Signal School at Scarborough developed specialized receivers using rotating loop antennas that could determine signal direction by measuring the variation in signal strength as the antenna rotated through 360 degrees. The system worked, but it was slow. By the time the operator found the null point, the antenna orientation where signal strength dropped to minimum, indicating the bearing perpendicular to the signal source, the transmission had often ended. The breakthrough came in 1941 with the development of the fixed-loop system using multiple stationary antennas arranged in precise geometric patterns. Instead of mechanically rotating a single antenna, the system compared signals received simultaneously by antennas pointing in different directions. Electronic circuits measured the phase differences between the signals and calculated bearing instantly in real time, even for transmissions lasting only a few seconds. The Adcock antenna array, named after engineer Frank Adcock, who pioneered the design in the 1920s, became the standard installation. 4 vertical antennas arranged in a square or diamond pattern, their outputs fed into a specialized receiver that displayed bearing as a visual indication on a cathode ray tube. An operator could read the bearing within seconds of transmission start, accurate to within 2 degrees under good conditions. The Royal Navy began installing shipboard HF/DF systems in 1941, designating them Type FH-3. The equipment was compact enough to fit aboard destroyers and corvettes, giving convoy escorts the ability to detect U-boat transmissions and determine their bearing without relying on shore stations. By late 1942, roughly 30% of Atlantic escorts carried FH-3 sets. That percentage would climb to over 70% by mid-1943, but even the early deployment created a detection network far more comprehensive than German planners imagined. Shore stations provided even more formidable coverage. The British established a network of direction-finding sites ringing the Atlantic approaches stations in Iceland, Northern Ireland, Scotland, Western Ireland, Gibraltar, West Africa, Newfoundland, and eventually along the eastern coast of the United States. Each station operated continuously, monitoring the high-frequency bands U-boats used for tactical communications. When a transmission was detected, operators noted the bearing, time, and frequency, then telephoned the data to a central plotting room at the Admiralty's Operational Intelligence Centre in London. There, specially trained staff maintained a master plot showing bearing lines from all stations that had detected each transmission. A U-boat 700 miles west of Ireland, transmitting to Paris, would be detected by stations in Western Ireland, Northern Ireland, and Iceland simultaneously. 3 bearing lines converging on a single position. Even if one station's bearing was slightly inaccurate, the intersection of the other 2 provided a reliable fix. More stations meant more bearing lines, more redundancy, and higher confidence in the position estimate. By late 1942, most U-boat transmissions in the North Atlantic were being plotted within 10 minutes of transmission end. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The plotting room at the Operational Intelligence Centre occupied a large space in the Admiralty building's basement, walls covered with massive charts of the Atlantic. Women from the Women's Royal Naval Service, the Wrens, staffed the plotting tables 24 hours daily, updating U-boat positions as direction-finding data arrived by secure telephone from coastal stations. Each position fix appeared as a small circle on the chart, the circle's diameter representing the estimated accuracy of the fix. Multiple fixes on the same boat created a track showing course and speed. Within hours, the plot revealed not just where individual boats were, but the larger pattern of how they were positioned. Commander Roger Wynne, the barrister-turned-intelligence officer who directed the Operational Intelligence Centre's submarine tracking room, understood that these plots represented something more valuable than individual boat positions. They revealed German operational intentions. When multiple U-boats moved into the same general area over several days, Wynne knew a patrol line was forming. When boats spaced themselves at precise intervals along a line perpendicular to expected convoy routes, he could predict where the trap was being set. Most critically, he could route convoys around the concentrations, turning the Wolfpack tactic into a strategic vulnerability rather than a tactical advantage. The German command structure made this vulnerability worse. Admiral Dönitz maintained centralized control over U-boat operations from his headquarters, first in Lorient, then in Paris after March 1942. He directed boats to specific positions, coordinated attacks on convoys, and micromanaged tactics through detailed radio instructions. This tight control required constant communication between headquarters and boats at sea. Boats reported their positions, fuel states, weather observations, and convoy sightings. Headquarters responded with operational orders, routing instructions, and tactical updates. The radio traffic volume was enormous, and every transmission was another direction-finding opportunity for Allied listeners. Dönitz knew the Allies possessed direction-finding equipment. German intelligence had captured British naval codebooks early in the war that referenced HF-DF procedures. The Kriegsmarine operated its own direction-finding network, the B-Dienst, which tracked Allied naval movements using similar techniques. But German planners made a critical miscalculation about the system's accuracy and coverage. They assumed direction-finding provided only approximate bearings. useful for general awareness that enemy ships were in a particular ocean area, but too imprecise for tactical action. They assumed shore stations could only detect transmissions within a few hundred miles, not across the entire Atlantic basin. They assumed shipboard systems were too inaccurate to be operationally useful. Every assumption was wrong. The technical capabilities of Allied HF, DF systems exceeded German estimates by an order of magnitude. A well-calibrated shore station using an Adcock array could achieve bearing accuracy of 1 to 2 degrees. At a range of 700 miles, 2 degrees translates to about 25 miles of positional uncertainty. Two stations, taking simultaneous bearings from different angles, would triangulate the position to within 10 miles. 3 or more stations, which was typical for transmissions from mid-Atlantic positions, could pinpoint a U-boat to within 5 miles. That level of accuracy was tactically actionable. A convoy could be rerouted to avoid submarines located with such precision. Shipboard FH-3 systems were less accurate than shore installations, typically achieving bearing accuracy of 5 to 7 degrees, but they provided something even more valuable: immediate tactical warning that a U-boat was nearby and preparing to attack. U-boats attempting to shadow convoys transmitted regular position reports to headquarters, allowing wolfpack coordination. The moment a shadowing boat transmitted, every FH-3 equipped escort within range detected it. The bearing might not be precise enough for an immediate depth charge attack, but it told escort commanders which sector of the convoy's perimeter was threatened. Escorts could shift position to screen that sector more heavily, or detach destroyers to sweep along the bearing line, forcing the shadowing boat to submerge and lose contact with the convoy. Captain Frederick Johnny Walker, commanding the 2nd Support Group aboard HMS Starling, developed tactics specifically exploiting shipboard HF-DF. When his operators detected a transmission bearing on a particular sector, Walker would order a high-speed sweep along that bearing, even if sonar contact hadn't been established. The sudden appearance of a destroyer racing toward them at 25 knots often panicked U-boat commanders into crash diving before they'd completed their transmission or received headquarters reply. The boat lost tactical situational awareness, broke contact with the convoy, and sometimes surfaced hours later, only to find the convoy had altered course and vanished. Walker's group sank 6 U-boats in one 6-week period using variations of this technique. The German command never fully grasped how completely their communications had become a tracking mechanism working against them. In January 1943, Kapitänleutnant Peter Erich Kramer, commanding U-333, filed a report noting that Allied escorts seemed to know his boat's position whenever he transmitted tactical updates to headquarters. Kramer had been shadowing a convoy in the North Atlantic, maintaining contact through the night while transmitting position reports every 4 hours as standing orders required. Each time he transmitted, escorts appeared along his bearing within 30 minutes, forcing him to dive and break contact. After the third occurrence, Kramer broke radio silence to ask Paris if his cipher codes might be compromised. The response from headquarters dismissed his concerns. The escorts' reactions were attributed to radar detection, not direction finding. Kramer was ordered to maintain reporting schedule. Other commanders filed similar reports throughout early 1943. Corvettenkapitän Siegfried von Forstner, commanding U-402, described multiple incidents where escorts appeared to respond directly to his transmissions. Captain Lieutenant Klaus Bargston aboard U-563 reported that whenever he transmitted weather reports, routine messages required by headquarters for operational planning, Allied aircraft arrived in his vicinity within an hour. The pattern was clear to boat commanders actually experiencing it. Transmitting attracted Allied attention with suspicious consistency. But headquarters, analyzing these reports from the security of Paris, consistently attributed the correlation to coincidence, radar detection, or Allied code breaking rather than direction finding. The institutional blind spot was partly psychological, admitting that routine, tactical communications were giving away boat positions would require fundamental changes in operational procedure. The centralized control system Dönitz had built over 3 years of Atlantic operations depended on constant communication between headquarters and boats. Reducing radio traffic would mean accepting less control, trusting individual commanders to make more independent decisions, operating with less situational awareness. The entire Wolfpack concept required coordination that was impossible without regular radio communication. Direction finding as a serious threat meant the operational system itself was creating the vulnerability. There was also a technical explanation. German signals officers found persuasive. The Kriegsmarine's own B-Dienst direction-finding network, while effective against Allied naval traffic, struggled with accuracy beyond 300 miles. German engineers knew the theoretical limits of their own equipment, atmospheric conditions, ionospheric, propagation, antenna limitations, signal strength variations. They assumed Allied equipment faced the same constraints. When reports suggested impossibly accurate direction finding at extreme ranges, German technical experts concluded the reports must be misinterpreting what was actually happening. Perhaps escorts were responding to radar contacts or visual sightings, and coincidentally doing so shortly after radio transmissions. The correlation might be spurious rather than causal. This technical conservatism reflected a broader German tendency to underestimate Allied technological capabilities. The Kriegsmarine had entered the war with what many considered the world's most advanced submarine force, excellent boats, highly trained crews, sophisticated tactical doctrine. German engineers had developed the magnetic torpedo pistol, the acoustic homing torpedo, the snorkel breathing system, eventually the revolutionary Type XXI electroboat. Why would they assume British or American engineers had achieved breakthroughs German technology hadn't matched? The possibility that the Allies had developed direction-finding systems significantly superior to German equivalents challenged assumptions about technological parity that were comforting and strategically important to maintain. The reality was that Allied development efforts in electronic warfare had proceeded on a scale Germany couldn't match. British scientists working on radar, sonar, direction finding, and electronic countermeasures had access to industrial resources, manufacturing capacity, and scientific personnel that dwarfed what Germany could allocate to comparable programs. The United States entered the war with massive research establishments at MIT, Columbia, Harvard, and California universities that mobilized thousands of physicists and engineers for military technology development. The Manhattan Project absorbed enormous resources, but so did radar development, submarine detection research, and communications, intelligence. The Allies were winning a technological race Germany hadn't fully realized it was running. The strategic impact of HF-DF became brutally apparent in the convoy battles of March 1943. Convoy HX 229 and SC 122, sailing independently but converging on similar routes across the North Atlantic, attracted the attention of 3 German Wolfpacks, Raubgraf, Stürmer, and Dränger, totaling 44 U-boats positioned in patrol lines across their projected paths. The concentration represented one of Dönitz's most ambitious efforts to achieve a decisive victory in the tonnage war. The engagement that followed, fought between March 16th and 20th, would result in the loss of 21 merchant ships, totaling 141,000 tons, the highest Allied losses from any single convoy battle of the war. But the battle also revealed something German commanders found deeply unsettling. Despite achieving significant sinkings, the Wolfpacks experienced difficulty maintaining contact with the convoys. Boats attempting to shadow and transmit position updates repeatedly found themselves forced to dive by escorts that appeared with uncanny speed and precision. Kapitänleutnant Manfred Kinzel, commanding U-338, transmitted 3 position reports on the night of March 18th while maintaining visual contact with HX 229's rear columns. After his 3rd transmission, at 23:14 hours, a destroyer appeared astern, racing toward his position at high speed. Kinzel crash-dived, losing contact with the convoy entirely. When he surfaced 90 minutes later and attempted to regain contact, the convoy had altered course and disappeared into the darkness. The incident repeated across the entire Wolfpack. Boats would establish contact, transmit tactical updates to coordinate the attack, then be forced underwater by escorts responding directly toward their positions. The escorts weren't searching randomly, they appeared to know exactly where transmitting boats were located. Kinzel noted in his war diary, recovered decades later from German naval archives, that the destroyer's approach bearing was within 10 degrees of his transmission antenna's orientation. The precision suggested the escort had detected his radio signal and taken a direct bearing on it, exactly what HF-DF was designed to accomplish. The Operational Intelligence Centre's submarine tracking room in London had been following the development of these Wolfpacks for over a week before the convoys entered the danger area. Shore-based HF-DF stations detected the boats moving into position as they transmitted routine position reports and weather observations to Paris. Each transmission added another position fix to the plot. By March 14th, the tracking room had identified 3 separate patrol lines and plotted their approximate locations with sufficient accuracy to estimate that HX-229 and SC-122 would pass through the concentration zone. Commander Wynne faced a painful choice. Rerouting both convoys to avoid all 3 patrol lines would require course changes so radical they would add days to the crossing time, consuming scarce fuel and potentially creating new vulnerabilities. The convoys would also need to break radio silence to receive the rerouting orders, which carried its own risks if German listening posts intercepted the traffic. Wynne decided on a compromise order course changes that would avoid the densest parts of the patrol lines, while accepting that some contact was unavoidable. The convoys altered course on March 15th, passing north of Raubgrafpack's patrol line rather than directly through it. The tactic partially succeeded. Initial contact came later, and from fewer boats than would have occurred without the rerouting. But once contact was established, the battle unfolded with the violence characteristic of major Wolfpack engagements. U-boats penetrated the escort screen, fired torpedoes at close range, and achieved devastating hits on merchant ships carrying fuel, munitions, and supplies vital to Britain's survival. The escorts responded with depth charge attacks, hedgehog patterns, and aggressive pursuit of radar and sonar contacts. The ocean became a killing ground where both sides suffered heavily. What German commanders noted in their post-action reports was not the tactical success they had sunk ships, but the operational difficulty. Coordinating attacks required communication, and communication drew immediate response from escorts equipped with direction-finding equipment. Some commanders began experimenting with shorter transmissions, compressed message formats that reduced time on the air. Others tried transmitting from positions offset from their actual location, surfacing briefly to transmit, then submerging and moving before escorts arrived. These improvised countermeasures achieved limited success. Even brief transmissions provided enough signal for accurate bearings, and escorts responding to a direction-finding contact would search the surrounding area thoroughly enough to often locate boats that had moved a few miles from their transmission point. Dönitz's staff reviewed the action reports from HX-229 and SC-122 with growing concern. The tonnage sunk was impressive, over 140,000 tons from a single operation, but the after-action analysis revealed disturbing trends. Boats had difficulty maintaining sustained contact with convoys despite favourable weather conditions and good visibility. Escorts appeared to respond to transmissions with suspicious consistency. Several commanders specifically mentioned destroyers approaching from bearings aligned with their transmission antennas. The circumstantial evidence was mounting that Allied direction-finding capabilities exceeded German intelligence estimates. The B-Dienst, the Kriegsmarine Signals Intelligence Service, initiated an investigation into Allied HF-DF capabilities in late March 1943. The investigation team, led by specialists from the Naval Communications Service, analysed captured documents, interrogation reports from Allied prisoners, and technical intelligence on equipment recovered from destroyed or captured ships. What they discovered should have alarmed German naval leadership far more than it did. Multiple sources confirmed that Allied escorts carried high-frequency direction-finding equipment as standard fit by late 1942. Technical manuals recovered from a damaged destroyer described FH-3 system capabilities, including bearing accuracy specifications, operational procedures, and tactical employment guidelines. The investigation's findings were distributed to U-boat headquarters in April 1943. The report concluded that Allied shipboard HF, DF provided tactically useful bearing information on U-boat transmissions, though German analysts still underestimated the system's accuracy and the density of coverage provided by shore stations. The report recommended that boats minimize radio traffic, use shortest possible message formats, and avoid transmitting while in close proximity to enemy forces. These recommendations were issued as operational guidance to boat commanders, but they represented minor tactical adjustments rather than fundamental changes to the communication-dependent command system. The institutional resistance to reducing radio traffic ran deep in U-boat command's operational culture. Dönitz had built his entire tactical system around centralized control enabled by constant communication. The Wolfpack concept required boats to report contacts so headquarters could vector other boats to intercept. Weather reporting allowed headquarters to predict convoy routes and position patrol lines accordingly. Position reports gave headquarters the situational awareness necessary to manage operations across the entire Atlantic theater simultaneously. Reducing communication meant accepting reduced control, operating with less information, trusting individual commanders to make tactical decisions without guidance from Paris. There was also a strategic calculation involved. Even if transmissions were being located by direction finding, the Wolfpack tactic had achieved considerable success through early 1943. Over 700,000 tons of Allied shipping had been sunk in the first quarter of the year. The exchange rate tonnage sunk versus U-boats lost still favored Germany, though the margin was narrowing. Dönitz believed the campaign could still be won through persistence, through maintaining pressure on the convoy routes until Allied shipbuilding capacity was overwhelmed. Reducing radio traffic might improve individual boat survival rates, but would undermine the coordinated operations necessary to achieve the tonnage levels required for strategic success. This calculation rested on assumptions about Allied industrial capacity that were already becoming obsolete. American shipyards were producing Liberty ships faster than U-boats could sink them. The production rate had accelerated from roughly 0.5 ships per day in 1942 to over 1.5 ships per day by spring 1943. The United States alone would launch over 3,000 merchant ships during the war, a construction rate that made the tonnage war mathematically unwinnable for Germany unless U-boat effectiveness increased dramatically. Instead, effectiveness was decreasing as Allied countermeasures, radar, sonar, direction finding, escort carriers, long-range patrol aircraft deployed in combinations that created overlapping layers of detection coverage. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The convoy battles of April 1943 demonstrated the cumulative effect of these Allied advantages. On 5, a slow westbound convoy of 43 merchant ships, escorted by 16 warships, was attacked by approximately 30 U-boats from 3 Wolfpacks between April 28th and May 6th. The battle became one of the most intense anti-submarine actions of the entire war. The escorts, equipped with radar, improved sonar, shipboard HF, DF, and supported by very long-range Liberator aircraft from Iceland, detected and engaged U-boats repeatedly before they could achieve favorable attack positions. The HF-DF component was particularly effective during On-5's ordeal. Every time a shadowing boat transmitted position updates to coordinate the Wolfpack, escorts detected the transmission and obtained a bearing. Destroyers would race along that bearing, forcing the boat to dive and lose contact. The pattern repeated throughout the multi-day battle. U-boats would establish contact, attempt to maintain surveillance while reporting to headquarters, then be driven off by escorts responding to their transmissions. Some boats managed to penetrate the screen and fire torpedoes, sinking 13 merchant ships, but the cost was unprecedented. 6 U-boats were definitively sunk, with several others damaged so severely they were forced to abort their patrols and return to base. Kapitän-Leutnant Herbert Neckel, commanding U-638, experienced the full impact of Allied detection capabilities during the On-5 battle. On May 4th, he gained contact with the convoy's starboard flank and transmitted a detailed position report to Paris at 1942 hours. The message took approximately 90 seconds to transmit using standard naval Enigma encoding. Within 5 minutes of transmission end, Neckel's hydrophone operator reported fast propeller beats approaching from the northeast, the exact reciprocal bearing of his transmission antenna's orientation. HMS Sunflower, a Flower-class corvette equipped with FH-3 direction-finding equipment, had detected U-638's transmission and immediately closed on the bearing at full speed. Neckel crash-dived to 100 meters and attempted silent running. Sunflower prosecuted the contact aggressively using sonar, dropping patterns of depth charges that bracketed U-638's position with terrifying accuracy. The attack continued for 2 hours, with Sunflower being joined by HMS Loosestrife, another FH-3-equipped escort that had also detected the original transmission. The 2 corvettes worked in coordination, one maintaining sonar contact while the other attacked, a tactical pattern developed specifically to exploit direction-finding contacts. U-638 survived by diving to dangerous depths and enduring pressure hull stress that came within pounds per square inch of catastrophic failure, but the boat was too damaged to continue operations and was forced to return to base. The statistical summary of May 1943's convoy battles revealed a transformation in the Battle of the Atlantic that German naval leadership could no longer ignore. 41 U-boats were lost during the month, nearly 25% of operational strength. Merchant ship sinkings dropped to 50 vessels, totaling 264,000 tons, less than half the previous month's totals. For the first time in the war, U-boats were being destroyed faster than shipyards could build them, while Allied merchant production continued accelerating. The exchange rate had collapsed completely. On May 24, 1943, Admiral Dönitz made the most painful decision of his career. He ordered all U-boats to withdraw from the North Atlantic convoy routes, officially citing the need for boats to receive upgraded radar warning equipment and improved anti-aircraft armament. The actual reason, communicated through more restricted channels to senior staff, was that continuing operations under current conditions meant losing the entire operational fleet within 3 months. The wolf packs that had dominated Atlantic convoy routes for 3 years were retreating, acknowledging defeat in the campaign's critical theatre. The withdrawal order didn't mention direction finding specifically, but the cumulative impact of Allied HF-DF capabilities had been one of several technological factors that made the North Atlantic untenable for U-boat operations. Every transmission had become a beacon, showing Allied intelligence exactly where boats were positioned. The centralized command system that enabled Wolfpack coordination had become a vulnerability, creating predictable patterns of radio traffic that Allied tracking rooms exploited to route convoys around submarine concentrations. The more boats Dönitz committed to an operation, the more transmissions were required to coordinate them, and the more opportunities Allied direction-finding networks had to locate and plot their positions. German technical efforts to counter HF-DF never achieved the sophistication necessary to neutralize the threat. The Kriegsmarine developed the Courier transmission system in 1943, a high-speed burst transmission device that compressed standard message formats into transmissions lasting only a few seconds rather than a minute or more. The system reduced exposure time but couldn't eliminate it entirely. Even brief transmissions provided sufficient signal for bearing measurements by sensitive Allied receivers. More fundamentally, Courier required specialized equipment that took months to produce and install across the operational fleet. By the time significant numbers of boats carried Courier systems in late 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had already been decided. Some commanders adopted radio silence policies, transmitting only when absolutely necessary and accepting reduced coordination with headquarters. These boats often operated more successfully than those maintaining regular communication schedules, but they undermined the Wolfpack system's fundamental premise. Independent operators couldn't be positioned to intercept convoys efficiently, couldn't be concentrated against high-value targets, and couldn't be redirected based on intelligence updates from headquarters. The tactical advantage of radio silence came at the cost of strategic effectiveness. The post-war analysis conducted by Allied intelligence services revealed the full scope of HF-DF's contribution to victory in the Atlantic. British and American analysts estimated that direction-finding data influenced routing decisions for over 70% of convoys crossing the North Atlantic during 1943. Convoys routed around known U-boat concentrations experienced loss rates averaging less than 2% compared to over 5% for convoys that encountered wolf packs. The ability to avoid submarine concentrations identified through direction finding saved hundreds of merchant ships and thousands of crew lives while reducing the U-boats' opportunities to inflict the tonnage losses Germany needed to win the campaign. The shore station network's effectiveness proved particularly decisive. The coverage density achieved by mid-1943 meant that almost every U-boat transmission from anywhere in the Atlantic basin was detected by at least 2 stations, usually 3 or more. The resulting position plots, updated continuously as boats transmitted routine messages, gave the submarine tracking room unprecedented situational awareness. Commander Wynn's team often knew where U-boats were positioned more accurately than Dönitz's own staff did, since German position reports from individual boats reflected where they had been hours earlier when transmitting, not necessarily their current locations. The psychological impact on U-boat crews mirrored the effects of radar and sonar technological disadvantages. Men realized they were fighting an enemy that could detect them through mechanisms they couldn't counter. Every transmission became an act carrying mortal risk. The radio operator pressing the transmit key knew he might be signing death warrants for his entire crew. Some men developed superstitious rituals around transmissions, specific prayers, lucky charms, elaborate procedural sequences meant to somehow protect against detection. The rituals had no effect, but they provided psychological comfort in an environment where technology had made survival increasingly dependent on factors beyond individual skill or courage. Captain Lieutenant Peter Erich Kremer, who survived the war after commanding 5 different boats, including U-333, described the radio transmission dilemma in his post-war memoir. Every time we surfaced to transmit tactical reports, we understood we were potentially giving away our position. But orders required regular communication with headquarters. We needed updates on enemy movements, convoy routing intelligence, operational, instructions. The system demanded communication, even though communication was killing us. Some commanders began falsifying their position reports, transmitting coordinates offset from their actual positions by 20 or 30 miles. Headquarters never noticed the deception, which told us they weren't cross-checking our reports against other intelligence. But Allied direction finding still provided accurate bearings regardless of what positions we claimed in our messages. The direction-finding threat remained classified long after the war ended. The British government didn't declassify details of the HF-DF network until the 1970s, decades after the technology had been superseded by satellite surveillance and other electronic intelligence systems. The secrecy was maintained partly because direction-finding techniques remained operationally useful in Cold War submarine tracking, and partly because revealing the full scope of Allied signals intelligence capabilities might have provided insights into other classified programs. When German veterans learned the full extent of HF-DF coverage during the war, many expressed the same mixture of resignation and respect that characterized their responses to learning about Allied radar and sonar advantages. They recognized they had been fighting against industrial and technological capabilities that Germany couldn't match. The coordination and resource allocation required to establish a comprehensive direction-finding network spanning an entire ocean basin reflected Allied strategic advantages that extended far beyond any single technology or tactical system. Admiral Dönitz, interrogated by Allied intelligence officers after Germany's surrender, acknowledged that U-boat command had underestimated Allied direction-finding capabilities, but maintained that better signals intelligence wouldn't have changed the campaign's outcome. Germany's fundamental problem was the impossibility of winning a tonnage war against American industrial production. Even if U-boats had been able to communicate without detection, even if radar and sonar hadn't provided the Allies with detection advantages, the mathematics of merchant ship construction versus submarine sinkings made German victory impossible once American shipyards reached full production capacity in 1943. This assessment contained truth but also served as self-justification. The technological disadvantages created by Allied advances in radar, sonar, and direction finding had accelerated German defeat and increased U-boat casualties beyond what they would have been in a more evenly matched technological contest. The men who died in crushed submarines might have survived if their transmissions hadn't been instantly located by direction-finding networks. The strategic outcome might have been the same, but the human cost was shaped by specific technological capabilities that German intelligence failed to assess accurately, and German command failed to counter effectively. The final accounting of the Atlantic campaign confirmed direction finding's role among the constellation of technologies that turned the battle against Germany. Of approximately 40,000 men who served in U-boats during the war, roughly 30,000 died a 75% casualty rate, unprecedented in any military service. They died in boats that became tombs when depth charges crushed pressure hulls, in boats that burned when fuel oil ignited from combat damage, in boats that suffocated when air systems failed during prolonged submergence while evading hunters. Many died because their boats transmitted routine messages that Allied direction-finding networks converted into targeting coordinates for escorts and aircraft that would otherwise never have found them in the vastness of the Atlantic. The technology that accomplished this high-frequency direction-finding was neither exotic nor revolutionary. The underlying physics had been understood since the 1920s. The equipment was straightforward by World War II standards, requiring precision manufacturing, but no theoretical breakthroughs. What made HFDF decisive was deployment at scale, integration into operational doctrine, and systematic exploitation through dedicated intelligence organizations that understood how to convert bearing data into strategic advantage. The Allies didn't win because they invented direction finding. They won because they implemented it comprehensively across an entire theater and built operational systems that used the intelligence it provided. The lessons influenced Cold War submarine operations profoundly. Soviet and American submarine forces both recognized that radio communications created vulnerability. Nuclear submarines operating on extended patrols maintained strict radio silence, except for scheduled brief transmissions, using extremely low-frequency communication systems that were much harder to direction find than the high-frequency signals U-boats used. The Wolfpack concept, which required constant tactical communication, became obsolete. Modern submarine doctrine emphasized independent operations, where boats pursued their missions without coordination through radio messages that might betray their positions. The electronic warfare revolution that HFDF represented continued accelerating through subsequent decades. Direction finding evolved into comprehensive signals intelligence systems that could not only locate transmitters, but also analyze, decode, and exploit their communications. The electromagnetic spectrum became a domain of warfare as important as sea, land, or air. Every transmission, radio, radar, satellite, cellular, created a signature that sophisticated detection systems could exploit. The principle established in the Atlantic in 1943 remained valid. Anything that radiates can be detected, located, and targeted if your opponent possesses the technology and deploys it effectively. For the men who served in U-boats, who heard their radio operators transmit messages and wondered if escorts were taking bearings on those transmissions at that very moment, the knowledge came too late to save them. They had been fighting a campaign where their own communication system was simultaneously enabling their operations and betraying their positions. The centralized command structure that Admiral Dönitz believed was a strategic advantage had created a systematic vulnerability that Allied technology exploited with devastating effectiveness. They transmitted coordinates to Paris so headquarters could coordinate Wolfpack operations. Allied shore stations triangulated those transmissions and plotted their positions on charts in London. The convoys altered course, avoiding the submarines, surviving to deliver the cargo that would sustain Britain and eventually enable the invasion of occupied Europe. The irony was complete and crushing. The more aggressively Germany attempted to coordinate U-boat operations through radio communication, the more effectively Allied intelligence could track submarine dispositions and route convoys safely through the Atlantic. The technology existed on both sides, but only one side deployed it with the coverage density, analytical sophistication, and operational integration necessary to achieve strategic effect. That asymmetry, combined with similar asymmetries in radar, sonar, industrial production, and cryptographic security, determined the Battle of the Atlantic's outcome more decisively than the courage or skill of men fighting on either side. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.